Okay, I'd like to get started. Welcome. This is the ARIN Public Policy Consultation at NANOG 57. I'm John Curran, the President and CEO. I'd like to do a little bit of introduction about this session, and I will then invite up some other speakers who will actually run it. So first, the Public Policy Consultation is an open public discussion of Internet Number Resource Policy held with ARIN facilitating the in-person and remote participation. We hold these at our public meetings, but we also can hold them at other forums with the approval of the Board of Trustees, including NANOG. So there's a little bit of a new thing for us. Figured we would get input on the policies from a greater audience than just the ones who happen to stay after a NANOG meeting to catch ARIN or come out specifically for us. Today's agenda has three proposed policy changes. Draft Policy 2012-2, IPv6 Subsequent Allocation Utilization Requirement. Policy Proposal 182, Update Residential Customer Definition, not to exclude wireless as residential service. And Draft Policy 2013-1, which was ARIN Policy Proposal 183, which is Section 8.4 Transfer Enhancement. We'll also have an open microphone for policy issues where people can raise topics that they think should be worked on or things that need to be looked at, and you can find each other and get together and work on policy proposals. So let us move right ahead. Remote participants. We have remote participants. If you're a remote participant or if you're watching this from NANOG, please go to ARIN PPC. You can get the discussion guide that has all the policy proposals in it. This is being webcast. There's a live transcript. The meeting materials are downloadable. There's a chat room. If you've registered for the chat room, then there's an online virtual microphone queue, and you can participate when we do a show of hands for indicating policy support. Rules and reminders. The chair, in this case ARIN's Vice Chair, Paul Andersen, will moderate the discussion of the draft policies so all can speak and all can be heard. Please state clearly your name and affiliation each time you're recognized at the mic. That's also a NANOG thing, and they nicely have the microphones already labeled. Please comply with the rules and courtesies in the discussion guide. If you have one of these nice yellow discussion guides, there's a bunch of courtesies in them. At the head table, Paul Andersen, our Vice Chair and Treasurer, myself, John Curran, President and CEO. We have Chris Grundemann from the ARIN AC, Robert Seastrom from the ARIN AC, Stacy Hughes from the ARIN AC, and who's also our Jabber monitor, and John Sweeting, who's the chair of the ARIN Advisory Council. So I'm going to move right in. For each policy, I'll introduce the policy proposal. I'll turn it over to the representative from the ARIN AC, who will do their introduction to it, and then we'll open it up for questions and discussion. First policy is Draft Policy 2012-2, IPv6 Subsequent Allocation Utilization Requirement. Its origin was as ARIN Proposition 159 in November 2011. AC Shepherds, Heather Schiller, and Kathy Aronson. It was presented at both ARIN 29 and ARIN 30 and identified as needing more work. The text and assessment is online and in your discussion guide. Online, the URL is there. The intent is to allow ISPs that have begun using IPv6 but may not have sufficiently planned for a longer-term growth to receive an additional allocation. Once you've set up your V6 allocation plan, if you find out that you need more resources, you shouldn't have to necessarily change the plan just because it didn't work out perfectly. There are no similar proposals or discussions in the other RIRs. Staff comments and issues. These are online in the staff assessment. We think we understand the intent of the policy, but the new policy text has a sentence which says, having allocated more than 90% of their serving site blocks to serving sites and has sufficient actual utilization of their serving sites to continue to justify the block size being utilized for all serving sites as specified in Section 652 as unclear. Staff has suggested slightly clearer text which says has allocated more than 90% of total address space to serving sites, with the block size allocated to each being justified based on the criteria in section 652. Slightly different, but more clear when you look at it. We recommend that, but we understand the intent of the policy proposal either way. Legal assessment, the policy does not create significant legal issues. And now I will open it up to the ARIN AC Shepherd, Rob Seastrom. Should be right there if you go next. Okay. Do you have any slides?
I don't have any additional.
You just leave that up and you can talk about it.
Okay, so my summary that I always give people about this is that we're still evolving in the way that we're laying out IPv6 networks. And particularly in the case of very large service providers, we need a little bit of flexibility to be able to do that as the best practices evolve. And that needs to be policy that is commensurate with our mission of stewardship, but also recognizes that the IPv6 world and the IPv4 world are completely different in terms of what adequate stewardship actually means and how plentiful the address space is. Do we have any slides up here at all? So, okay, yeah. Problem statement is that we have artifacts of the IPv4 scarcity and slow start thinking. This policy attempts to mitigate that to a certain extent by allowing a longer term planning window and allowing some mid-course corrections as the space is rolled out in a service provider's network with customers actually on it. So so text part one, I'm going to commit the sin of reading directly from the slide here because we're actually discussing what's the policy proposal actually is. We're adding a section 2.14 serving site. When applied to IPv6 policies, the term serving site shall mean the location where an ISP terminates or aggregates customer connections, including but not limited to points of presence, data centers, central or local switching office, or regional or local combinations thereof. Does not require the implementation of such aggregation and routing. Only the implementation of an addressing plan that is subnetted along these topological boundaries to support the ability to aggregate. So the bold text there is new. Part two, section 653, we are adding an LIR qualifies for subsequent allocation if they meet any of the following criteria. We're adding has allocated more than 90% of their serving site blocks to serving sites and has sufficient actual utilization at their serving sites to continue to justify the block size being utilized for all serving sites as specified in 652. Oh, the red button. Okay. So those are the changes, and ARIN analysts take a liberal view of what's considered justification here. This is not the regime that you're used to in IPv4, where we look at every single allocation and every single SWIP record under a microscope to determine its provenance and whether it's properly ripe and all that. This is a cut up your network in a way that allows for sufficient growth and a good runway so as to not be re-architecting one's numbering strategy every couple of months as the network grows. And if one does that with a reasonable set of expectations for growth, over time, they will inevitably prove to be wrong. You'll see fractionally more growth in New York than you will in LA. You'll run out of stuff in Chicago. Something will happen where you need more address space. Everything that you've put out in the network is eminently justifiable, and but yet you need more address space because you aren't out in sufficient places to justify it in a way that would be justified under the scarcity regime. And at this point, you want to be able to get more addresses without blowing up all the planning that you did for your nice hierarchical addressing scheme. So I'd like to open up the microphones for discussion. I see people are leaving the room already. Wow, that must have been really exciting. Paul will moderate. Thank you.
Is this yours? So if anybody has any discussion or feedback, again, the purpose of this section is to give feedback to our advisory council, who is responsible for moving these proposals forward. So if anybody would like to speak, whether they are in favor, against, think this is a problem we're solving. Mike, right, Mike?
Lee Howard. It is my observation that
An organization?
Lee Howard, Time Warner Cable. It is my observation that whenever we have an open mic session or some kind of discussion, that somebody has to go first or the conversation never gets started. It sounds like this is potentially a slight but not significant liberalization. That there could be potentially a few more blocks of addresses coming out. Anybody feel like nodding or shaking their head? Nobody's nodding or shaking their head. Looks to me like this is potentially slightly more liberal. In that sense, I think that's probably a good thing, as we are still, in fact, learning better ways to do our address allocations and assignments internally. So, sounds like probably a good idea.
And are you, so you're in favor of the direction?
Sounds like it's probably a good idea.
Yes. Senator Mike.
Jason Schiller, Google on the ASOAC. As written, Google, myself, and my colleagues were opposed to this text when we discussed it last for a number of kind of nitpicky issues. All in all, I think the sentiment is a good idea. I'd like to first backpedal for the room and talk about why this policy is before us. And that's because a while back we changed the initial allocation for IPv6 policy, and we made that more liberal. The problem was most of the ISPs that came qualified for a 32. They got a 32, and based on the policy as it was written at that time, it had to be fairly well utilized before they could come back for more. When the initial allocation policy was changed, then anyone who hadn't gotten space could suddenly qualify for much more space. So the idea here was to put the subsequent allocation policy in line with the new, more liberal initial allocation policy. And I support that. One of my concerns, as written with this policy, is, if you go back one slide, the definition of serving site. And this is going to get complicated, so I apologize. But one of my concerns is when the new initial allocation policy was passed, it was believed that you could use serving sites and aggregation as a way to size how much IPv6 addressing you could get, but have no intention of implementing such aggregation or hierarchy. And then the expectation is that you could come back with a single serving site, qualifying for being out of address space as a single serving site, and get additional space. But the amount of additional space you could get would again be calculated on the formula that takes this hierarchy and oversizing into account. The way the definition of serving site is going to newly be defined suggests that you actually have to put that addressing plan into effect in order to make use of this oversizing. So the question is, why make that change?
Mr. Seastrom?
Well, I'm going to answer that question, actually.
Oh, well, that makes it better. Mr. Schiller.
So the answer to that is there's also been some discussion about how is this dealt with when you have a hierarchy of serving sites. For example, you have an edge router that's aggregating customers, a number of edge routers in a single location aggregate up to a hub aggregation router. You've carved your network into metros or regional blocks within a single continent. So if one takes the original formula where you take your most heavily loaded serving site and count the number of elements underneath it and then multiply that by the number of serving sites, if you do that up your hierarchy, you can qualify for much more address space. And the concern was that people would come up with interesting and complicated hierarchical addressing plans just to qualify for additional IP space. And the goal with this text was to try and say, you're actually going to subnet your numbering scheme along the lines you described. And I think that that makes good sense, maybe to restrict people coming up with crazy hierarchical schemes. But I think it's important to not change the rules that existed in the now current initial allocations, which is that you can certainly simply use this hierarchical math as an oversizing number to determine how much address space you can get. So we need to try to figure out how to balance those two things. That's my advice.
Mr. Seastrom want to respond, and then Mr. Curran, and stick around for 1 second.
So yeah, Jason, I had a question. Since you said people would, with the understanding that one actually needs budget to put equipment out there and then subsequently number it, and needs customers on that equipment to be able to justify coming back under this proposal, I'm going to ask you rhetorically. I don't want you to actually name names here, but who are these people that would be doing this? How many of them are there in the world? And does this possibility of a corner case for hoarding something that's an incredibly plentiful resource in a corner case where the number of organizations that might try it might, for some weird reason, might be something that would be able to be counted on one finger? Is that a reasonable thing to be worried about?
So, to respond to you, Jason Schiller, Google, I think the number of companies that would benefit from having much more larger oversized chunks of address space are few and far between. I think more than one, but probably less than 10, probably around the neighborhood of 5. And I think if those companies are allowed to scoop up extra address space, in the grand scheme of how much space is available in IPv6, it's negligible. However, I think that we also need to write good policy that has supported the community and will pass through the public policy process. And I suspect there are people that have concerns, even given how small the extra address space will be consumed is in the face of the total V6 pool, and how few companies potentially would be interested in exercising this.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to point out that any policy out there is absolutely subject to loopholing and abuse by people who have the right spirit. So, thank you.
This is John Curran, and it's regarding the staff interpretation of both of these. So, this policy proposal, if adopted, would allow another way for someone to get an additional allocation, which is necessary because right now it is possible, by following your addressing plan, to find yourself in an end case that wouldn't allow you, hence the additional bullet under 653B. With that fixed, I think it's now feasible, if the community wants to require organizations to actually make use of the addressing plan that they showed up with when they requested their address space, and not say their routing follows that, but that their actual addressing plan is as they described it. It is true that the way around the corner case in 6B, in the past, the answer has been, well, it really doesn't matter what your plan that you justified your V6 allocation is, you can go do something else. And that's necessary if someone's going to find themselves in a dead end. Now that if you adopt this policy proposal and you've added to 653B the text that allows someone who has run out of serving site blocks to get another allocation, then it's no longer necessary for them to be able to rearrange their addressing plan, and it's worth holding them to the addressing plan. We have the one problem with people, if they're not held to their addressing plan, is, as Jason said, convoluted hierarchical assignment schemes actually use a lot of bits very quickly. You find yourself down in the 6/16s and /18s more rapidly than you might imagine. So I think that if the community recognizes that this prevents an organization from getting stuck with its addressing plan, because now if they run out of serving site blocks, they have an option, then the text of serving site is quite reasonable. If you didn't have 653B, then the 2.1 change might leave some organizations in a bind.
Mr. Schiller.
Jason Schiller, Google. So in the event that somebody decides to build a flat network with no hierarchy, they have a single serving site, they can certainly use up all the available blocks in their serving site and qualify to come back and get more space as you just described. I'm not concerned about that piece. The piece that I'm concerned about is when such a network comes back, how much space do they qualify for? And under the current initial allocation, they can pick some hierarchy in their network as a serving site and count the number of elements under that serving site and then multiply that across the number of serving sites and then round that up to a nibble and come up with some sized chunk of addressing. If they then turn around and do a flat network and run until they're exhausted and qualify to come back for more, can they use that same formula that says n number of things under a serving site times n number of serving sites comes up with some chunk, rounded up to a nibble? And based on this text, I think the answer is no. And that's kind of changing the rules, because I think the intention of the subsequent allocation was so that you could apply under the same policy as the initial allocation, which this is a difference.
So Jason, just to clarify, I think you earlier said that you do support the concept of the problem trying to be solved, but do you have these concerns with the text, obviously? Or did I misunderstand you?
Yes. So there's two prongs here. On one prong, you want to make sure that we're giving sufficient address space and dealing with hierarchy. And some of the language in the text is to try and constrain abuse of hierarchy just for the sake of getting additional addresses. There's some collateral damage along with that text in that it now changes the intent of the initial allocation as well. Because currently, as written, the initial allocation allows you to come to ARIN and say, look, I don't ever plan on having hierarchy in my network. However, I want a chunk of addresses that's this big based on this formula of n number of units under a serving site times n number of serving sites, even though I never plan to have hierarchy in my network. This will change that.
Okay. Oh, and John has a one follow-up. Go ahead, John.
So you are correct. The change to 214 being a definition actively changes more than just subsequent allocations. It changes how we will interpret initial allocations, requiring people to have some fidelity to the plan that they actually use. You're correct.
So seeing no one else at the mic, I'd like to move to close the mic. So if you had a comment or point that you'd like to make, either in support or against this, I'd ask you to move quickly. I'll just look over to Ms. Hughes and Bueller. Nothing in the remote participation. So with that, I will call the microphones closed and activate our elite team of pollers, if possible. And they'll give me some thumbs up. He's ready. So I'd like to pose the question to the room on the matter of draft policy ARIN 2012-2 IPv6 subsequent allocations utilization requirement. I'd ask those who support the direction that this policy is generally taking. Could I ask all those who believe that they support the direction this policy is taking to raise your hand high, please? Are you the test pattern, or are you just... Those who are supportive, in favor. I've got mine, but I'll wait for a signal that the... it could be far. I might not be seeing one. And those who do not support the direction this policy is taking, could you raise your hand high?
Remote participant.
Okay. Good. Are there any follow-ups you'd like to take, Mr. Sweeting, or is that separate? You should try to avoid follow-ups. Yeah. On the matter, 52 in the room, 1 in favor, 3 against. That input will be provided to the Advisory Council for their consideration. Mr. Curran.
Thank you, Vice Chair. Now I'm going to move on to the next policy change. We're discussing ARIN Policy Proposal 182, update residential customer definition to not exclude wireless as a residential service. History was proposed in October 2nd, 2012. The AC Shepherds are Dave Farmer and Chris Grundemann. The text is online in your discussion guide. Would change the definition of residential customer. Removes the requirement that internet access is provided at a physical residence, thus broadening the definition of a residential customer to all non-commercial users. That's the staff understanding. There's no similar proposals, discussions to our knowledge at other RIRs. Staff assessment. It's a policy proposal right now, so note that the AC is working with the originator to ensure we have a clear problem statement and clear policy text as required under the revised PDP that we just adopted. And the staff legal assessment will be performed once the AC has taken the text and submitted it to us. So I'm going to introduce now Chris Grundemann to talk about the Advisory Council and ARIN Proposition 182, this policy proposal.
All right, so I'll start with the policy proposal author's problem statement. I'm just going to read it out here. There is no difference between mobile and fixed aggregation and address assignment architectures in the real world of real networks. Consequently, ARIN policy should not assert there is a difference. We're still working with the Shepherd to kind of more clearly define the technical need. I can tell you that from the discussions that I and David and the other AC members have had with the author, the primary intent here is to change this definition in order to apply the residential broadband policy in the current NRPM to mobile providers and mobile subscribers, as well as fixed line and wireless, fixed wireless broadband subscribers. And I believe the reason for that, or the reason for that, is the residential broadband policy currently allows for a 50% utilization rate rather than an 80% utilization rate. And so that's what this is really about, is the ARIN policy should not assert there's a difference. What that's alluding to is the 50% versus 80% utilization rate for residential subscribers versus mobile subscribers. So the current text is fairly simple. It strikes at a place of residence and adds regardless of OSI layer 1 or 2 technologies, effectively changing the residential customer definition to, instead of define a residential customer, it now defines a personal user, basically, someone who's not a commercial user of the service. And with that, I think I'll open up the mics.
So as this is a proposal, not yet a formal draft policy, what would be also very useful is just if people feel that the problem statement is a problem worth solving. So even if you don't want to comment on the specific text, that would be useful. So I will open the mics and ask if those who might want to comment to approach. Right mic, sir. Name and affiliation, please.
Hi, Jason Clayberg, T-Mobile. Good overview. Again, the purpose here is really for policy parity. We believe when the policy was written, the functional pieces on the wireline network, whether it be a BRES, CMTS, TSLAM, historically, the policy was written for efficiencies. And with the evolution of the wireless network, what we're proposing are for like functions of the network that the policy be the same. That's essentially what we're asking for.
Thank you. Center microphone.
Matt Poundset, Affiliates. Sorry, I'm trying to piece together exactly how all this fits together, because as far as I can tell, Section 2.13 is a definition that is only applied in privacy issues. It changes the definition of residential customer, and the only places where the term residential customer appear is talking about who is privacy.
Go ahead, please go ahead.
Yeah, so you're exactly right. The current text, the current proposed text, does not do what the author wants to do. But what we're trying to discuss is what the author actually wants to do, and then we can figure out text later. I think.
Right, okay.
So I think you're absolutely correct. The definition was tied specifically to the residential customer privacy policy,
Yeah.
and that's the only place in the NRPM the term is used.
Okay.
So changing the definition does not do what the author thinks it does, but
Right.
still addressing the problem is worth it.
Okay. And I guess the other main comment I have is that there's still a massive problem with this problem statement because it doesn't actually describe a problem. It describes they can do it, so I should be able to too. The cable access providers had to go through a huge amount of work to justify changing the way allocation worked because of the way CMTSs operate. And as I understand it, this is what we're comparing to, right? I see no justification here for doing that for any other type of access. There's no explanation of why it's necessary. It simply boils down to they can do it, I should be able to too, and I don't think that's a good enough justification.
So you're not supportive of this problem statement?
No. I mean, it's entirely possible, reframed with lots of explanation about exactly how this works and why it's necessary. I could change my opinion, but the way this is written out now, no.
Well, conveniently, if I believe I go to the right mic, we can ask the author.
Jason Clayberg at T-Mobile. I'm not the author, but
Oh, sorry.
from our
He knows
company.
the
So
author.
so we're all on the same page. It's our understanding that obviously we're after Section 4237, and as interpreted by the ARIN team, that the intent was to address Section 2.13 so that it could be interpreted for parity. And I can understand that the cable and other wireline folks did have to do a lot of work, but at the end of the day, they did it for efficiencies in working with ARIN and for allocation, and we applaud that, right? What we're saying is, hey, we have the same type of problem. We'd like to share in some of those efficiencies.
So our apologies, as you flick madly through the book looking for 4237, you will notice it is not there.
Yeah, it's on the website.
We did identify, unfortunately, very late a printing error, but if you wish to follow along, you can just go to the ARIN website and see the current version of the PDP, and I'll turn over to Mr. Curran.
Yeah,
our apologies for that.
If you need to go to the ARIN website, you can pull down policies, pull down NRPM, and you'll see the text 4237, which applies to residential subscribers, and it's what would end up being implicated in this.
So sorry, staff do feel that 4237 would be implicated by this? Or you no comment?
So under 42373, there's a section called residential subscribers, which describes a alternate policy used for residential service areas of 50 to 80% utilization. So changing this definition would allow use of that residential subscriber section and the 50% utilization, which is what they're trying to affect. You can't discern that from looking at the discussion guide. You can if you go online.
Thank you for that clarification. A quick point from you. And then center microphone, please.
Brandon Ross, Network Utility Force. I don't believe the IP on my cell phone should be SWIPed. As far as the rest of the efficiencies, I don't see why one very specific technology, which is wireless, necessarily should be changed because it's sort of like residential. There might be something I'm not getting about it. I think there probably is. But it seems to me that we have rules for different technologies sometimes as exceptions for reasons, and so if that's what we should be discussing, I don't think this is the way to go about it. But I'm for changing the definition just because it's the definition that seems to make sense, but I don't really think that's the right way to do this, I guess. But I'm also very confused, so if I just confused everyone else, then maybe you should just ignore me.
Understood. So you're in favor of changing it to affect the privacy issues, but not
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. If there was ever any question about the privacy issue, which I don't think there ever was, then sure, but otherwise, I think we should discuss the real issue, whatever that is.
Thank you. Rob Seastrom?
Hi, Rob Seastrom, ARIN Advisory Council, and I work for a big MSO, which is also a small MVNO, so I know enough about this technology to be dangerous and probably make some very bad assumptions. So I'd appreciate it if our colleague from T-Mobile could sort of inform the discussion a little bit and explain a little bit more technical detail about what's going on, because to me, foreign agents and home agents look a lot more like a LAC-LNS pair than they do like CMTSs. And CMTS type architecture expanding into new areas was very much limited in where you can put stuff physically by the characteristics of the RF over glass plant and physics. So there was this requirement that the addresses actually physically live on the box. It would be as if the addresses had to be on the tower itself in a mobile sort of situation. And I'm confused as to why when, if you're going into a new area, that was the whole driver behind the 50% requirement. And if you're going to go into a new area, you need to be able to get more address space to put on that particular box, which is going in that particular physical location. I'm curious as to what's driving this from a mobile phone sort of perspective. I don't know what the appropriate term of art is here, but I hope that we can, in the discussion, decouple and not use the term wireless, because it unfortunately conflates people who are wireless ISPs, WISPs, doing 802.11 type stuff, which is very much has the same problem as the cable modem stuff pre-cable bundle in spades, from the discussion about your 3G, 4G LTE type of technology. So if you could provide some more technical data to shape that discussion, I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah. So Jason Clayberg, T-Mobile. So you raised some valid points here. Functionally, what we believe 4237 was written for, again, as a BRAS, CMTS, DSLAM, it's a functional piece of infrastructure aggregating subscribers at the end of the day, and that's where they anchor, where their home, their IP address, where IP addresses are, pools are configured, allocated, and dispersed to users. So again, it comes down to fundamentally the planning and the design piece of it. But again, that's our interpretation of why that section was built. So a CMTS equivalent to a wireless would be a GGSN and SMP gateway, something that essentially anchors the customer when they're within the geographic boundaries of the services that the IPs would live on. I apologize, that's a little bit vague. If you guys have some additional specific cases, questions, things like that, I'm happy to expand on it.
Thank you for that. Mr. Curran?
Right. Actually, probably the easiest way to think about what the issue might be defined as is if you look at the present residential customer definition, it's for individual persons who receive service at a residence. Fixed wireless, as some of us lived with in the LMDS days, actually could be considered a residential customer, okay, and would actually meet. What doesn't meet is service to a personal user who's in a geographic area but presently has no residence and is within the service area of a cell. That, ARIN would not consider meeting residential customer, where a fixed point-to-point wireless, we would. It's really the definition, the term fixing this for wireless parity is actually probably better defined as fixing it for mobile parity, which is what's being sought. You concur?
I think that makes sense. At the end of the day, it comes down to resources and allocation, right? So again, our interpretation of we didn't see a need in why this was proposed of whether a person was physically or billing-wise tethered to an address or if they're within a geographic zone. The purpose of, some of the ARIN records are for geolocation and upstream pieces. There's, some other things that, we could probably be educated on. But we really saw it because we can finitely identify customers to an area that there is commonality in the function of the equipment and thus the requests. Are there additional requirements or needs for direct physical tethering that would require physical? Just historically, it's been outlined in the policy, likely because that's what the solution was at the time, I assume.
Mr. Sweeting had a question. Far mic here on stage, please.
John Sweeting, ARIN Advisory Council Chair and Time Warner Cable. So what exactly would you use as a problem statement? What's the problem you're facing that you're looking to solve? If it's just, I think what people are saying, you're saying, yep, well, it's just not fair, that's our problem, but you must have a technical problem you're trying to overcome that you're facing each day.
Absolutely. So Jason Claver, T-Mobile again. It's really efficiency in working with the ARIN and allocating resources. We believe that this policy was written for that very reason. Otherwise, everybody would adhere to the normal 80%, but there's efficiencies in infrastructure serving larger masses. So the request really is for policy parity for V4, V6 future type allocations.
Okay, I'd like to go to the remote participation that's been patiently waiting, and I'd ask, though, before if anybody would like to make a comment still to approach the mics, because we're going to have to close due to time shortly.
Cameron Byrne, author of the policy, has a comment, and he says that ARIN staff describes residential policy is at 50%, and ARIN staff references the definition we are trying to change.
Thank you. Far mic.
John Springer, Inland Telephone, ARIN AC. Inland Telephone also is the majority partner in Inland Cellular Telephone, so this could end up affecting me. I'm in favor of moving this proposal forward in the policy process, but I have some heartburn about the problem statement. There's a lot of blank assertion that takes place in some of our policy proposals, and this is a good example of it. I'd like to see that fleshed out a little bit more. But I do support advancing the proposal in the process.
So last call, otherwise we will close the microphones unless I see someone moving now. I think based on the discussion, and this is still in the proposal phase, we'll take the feedback, we will pass the feedback to the, oh, was there one more comment? Okay. I'm sorry? Okay.
Chris Grundemann, ARIN AC, and as the one of the shepherds of this proposal, I'd really like to ask anyone who is in favor of this proposal moving forward and sees the problem to seek me out or David Farmer or come on the mailing list and let us know, because we're really trying to better define the problem statement. Because again, I think what we've heard over and over again is that the current policy isn't liked, but the current policy didn't come about out of a vacuum. It came about because there were specific technical needs that were expressed and solved. And what we'd like to really do is identify what that technical problem is and then solve it in the best way possible. So getting that more concrete problem statement rather than I don't like what the policy says is going to be very helpful moving forward.
You took the words out of my mouth. I think if anybody has input, please join the lists or seek out Chris in the hallway. We'll take the input that was gathered here and pass it on to the AC for consideration. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. I'm going to move ahead to the last policy proposal of this session, and that is Draft Policy 2013-1, Section 8.4, Transfer Enhancement. Origin, it originated as ARIN Policy Proposal 183 in October 2012. The AC Shepherds are Scott Librand and Heather Schiller. The text is online and in your discussion guide. What's not in your discussion guide is the NRPM section that applies. Again, you'll need to go to the NRPM online. This deals with Section 8. For those remote participants, you're already following, that's fine. ARIN staff summary. We have not done a staff assessment, but would allow inter-RIR ASN transfers. In looking at the text, there's no similar policy proposals or discussions, and staff assessment, it has been posted last week for discussion per the new PDP. Staff assessment will be performed upon request of the AC once the text is fully developed. One note that came out in the reading that we did is that by substituting IPv4 and ASNs for presently where it says IPv4 number resources, there is one little nit case where currently the inter-RIR transfer policy in one of the bullets precludes a participant from taking part in a transfer if they've already conducted one. And the question is whether this, a literal reading would say if you have transferred an ASN or V4, you can't transfer an ASN or V4. And potentially that might want to be respectively. If you've transferred a V4, then you cannot participate in another transfer for 12 months. Or if you've transferred an ASN, you can't. But that's a very small nit. The policy change is very simple, and it's a consequence of the simplicity of the text presently. So I'm now going to let the shepherd come up and talk about Section 8.4 transfer enhancement.
I think this said that Scott and Heather were the shepherds. Actually, that's Scott and me. I don't really look like Heather.
Jason's glad of that. Heather's happy.
Yeah.
A lot of people happy.
So, problem statement is that we're looking to encourage recovery and utilization of idle resources. You can already transfer ASNs within the ARIN region. That's already covered by existing policy. This would harmonize that policy with transfer policies that allow us to transfer number resources outside of the region. The text change is change all occurrences of IPv4 number resources to IPv4 number resources and ASNs, and change all occurrence of IPv4 address resources to IPv4 number resources and ASNs only in Section 8.4, which is the transfer outside of region policy. I guess we're at the end of the slide deck.
Keep doing the musical chairs here. So we'll open the microphones for those that would like to talk either in support or against this draft policy 2013-1. Again, Mr. Howard, just setting it off.
Lee Howard, Time Warner Cable. A number of people, maybe one, has done analysis on how much address space could potentially be transferred, IPv4 address space could potentially be transferred in a market or between regions or anything. Or maybe I haven't shown you guys that analysis yet, and that'll be at the next ANOC. Has anybody done any analysis on how many ASNs might be transferred? Is this a big problem, a small problem, a potato-shaped problem?
So, first, note that this is presently, if adopted in the ARIN region, one-hand clapping. A matching policy would need to be adopted in another region to allow inter-RIR ASN transfers. If that were to occur, then we could figure out what's potentially available to transfer. I'll note that we have had within the ARIN region 3 ASN transfers. I'll talk about that at NANOG tomorrow when I give the ARIN update. So ASN transfers aren't unheard of. People are asking, the policy proposal suggests that potentially, or the draft policy suggests potentially, that if an ASN transfer is useful, potentially it could be useful inter-RIR, but I'm not actually sure, unlike V4 that has a run-out condition, I'm not actually sure why an operator would need to transfer at all. So I don't know if there's a lot of demand. There's certainly a lot of supply.
Can I follow up on that question? Oh, no, can I follow up on that answer? Are you the transfers that have happened, are those specified transfers or those merger and acquisition transfers?
Specified transfers of, I believe, yeah, all three were 8.3 specified transfers of 3 ASNs. They're listed in the stats files and online.
The reason I ask is because you said that there is no run out of ASNs the way there is in V4 address space, but there are different sized ASNs, much like there are different size IP addresses. And so I could imagine there being some connection there, and some people want shorter ASNs or lower numbered ASNs or, you know, magic numbered ASNs or something. But I don't know, and that's what I'm trying to figure out is whether we need to spend time on this.
So currently we still have the shorter ones though, so I'm not sure, and we may have them for some time. So it may not be due to lack of availability. I do understand some people like ASNs that look pretty, and that might be pretty patterns or lower, but I don't think runout is a driver at this point, if that's the question.
And Mr. Howard, are you here to speak in favor or against, or you're still?
So at the moment, I am opposed because I can't find a reason. It doesn't look to me like it's actually needed, but I would be happy to entertain arguments that it is.
Thank you. That's wonderful input. Center microphone.
Matt Poundset, Affilius. Yeah, my comment is sort of related to the. While on the one hand, I understand the urge to symmetry. Yeah, I'm not exactly sure this is necessary. Like we have, there is no RIR that is running short on ASNs. I don't really see a particular reason to spend time on this unless somebody has come up against a specific problem that needs fixing. So yeah, I'd say I'm against it unless we can clarify that somehow.
Thank you. Center microphone when he makes his way.
Jason Schiller, Google. I agree with two previous speakers against for the same reasons. But in terms of symmetricalness, which is a desirable property, apparently, why would we not also include IPv6 number resources? Assuming we think having a symmetrical policy is important.
But you're opposed as written right now. Thank you. Did you want to respond to RS why IPv6 might not be included at this time?
Because they weren't in the policy proposal as originally submitted by the author.
So we've had 3 people so far not in favor. Is anybody maybe who might want to come and speak in favor? Or anybody wish to speak? Quick look over here. Remote participant potentially coming in. Mr. Grundemann.
Chris Grundemann, RNAC. I do not hold this position, so I may poorly paraphrase it, but there has been some discussion on the PPML regarding rationale for ASN transfers, and one of them was basically along the lines of purchasing an ASN for the peering advantages, right? So that there may be an ASN that folks like to peer with, and if you were able to buy that number, they may want to just peer with you because you have that number. That was listed as a reason on the mailing list, right?
You're just giving us a point of information on support. Mr. Schiller?
Jason Schiller, Google. I think the point was slightly stronger, that in the case of some legal contracts, the ASN number might actually be included. So by grabbing hold of such a number, you could then have legal rights to peer.
Last call for microphone comments. Is there one to my left here? No? Mr. Howard.
Lee Howard, Time Warner Cable. Okay, so it took me a minute to sort of digest what Jason just said as a nuance of Chris's comment. So I think what Jason said is, if I'm able to buy, let's say, AS701, that's a funny looking AS. Let's say I can buy AS701 for $500, that there are contracts in existence which would give me rights, like I would then have legal rights based on existing contracts to require others to peer with me based on the fact that I bought an ASN. The law of unintended consequences trumps contract law. Let's not do this.
Far center microphone.
Marty. Marty Akamai. Lee, I think you're a little incorrect there. Most peering agreements are not codified in contracts, and they can be terminated at any time. In fact, it's even easier to terminate a peering agreement with a contract. You just stop sending prefixes. Thank you.
And Mr. Hannigan, are you in favor or against this policy?
I'm the author of the policy proposal. There were a few different reasons why I proposed it. One was the symmetry. Another was theoretical transfer between multiple entities, international, Akamai International BV, Akamai Latin America, Akamai North America, Inc., et cetera, et cetera. There was some thinking. I was also the author of the current the ASN transfer policy that we have now that allows specified transfers, sales, purchases, whatnot, and the motivation there was simple. There's a lot of kind of underground ASN transfer that happens. The who is not accurate, and there was an effort there to kind of help correct that. It did happen. Things are being documented as John kind of demonstrated. Same things happening internationally. Again, will it stop the cogs of commerce if we don't pass this proposal? Of course not. you want to accurate who is and you want to have everything above board, you might want to consider it.
Thank you, sir. Front and center microphone.
Brandon Ross, Network Utility Force. So Marty kind of said what I was about to say, is that if you don't do it, people are going to find some other way to do what they need to do and to build on the, if you want to de-peer someone question, if their AS number changes, that's a perfectly good time to say, oh, by the way, I actually didn't want to bother updating your config, I'll just de-peer you. So I believe there is some value to keeping the records accurate that is more valuable than the time we've already spent discussing this, and I don't really see the downside, so I am in favor.
Thank you. And so, last to Mr. Howard.
Lee Howard, Time Warner Cable. Just for, to respond back to Marty, who was responding to me, I don't disagree with your characterization of the existence of contracts and how contracts work and what clauses are usually in those things. I was specifically responding to Jason's assertion, and if, stipulating that, then that's my conclusion. I think we're on the same page as far as that goes.
Thank you. So the microphone's now being closed unless I'll just double check on remote participation. It can take an extra second. So I'd like to take a poll now. I'd ask, this is going to be our last audience participation polling of the day here, so if you could just give us a moment. If you can hear the sound of my voice, you are eligible to put your hand up either in favor or against the question of whether or not you support the direction of this policy. So I'd ask on the matter of draft policy 2013-1, section 8.4 transfer enhancement, all those in favor of the direction that the policy text is taking, could you please raise your hands high or submit in remote participation? Please put them up now, and please keep them up until I ask you to put them down, as I will look for a signal from our... Just a few moments.
If you could raise your hands nice and high,
Nice
that
and
would
high.
be helpful. The ceiling is sufficiently high, you will not hit it.
Who gives me the grade? I believe we are good, so you can put your hands down. I ask now for all those who are opposed to the policy this direction is taking, if you could please raise your hand nice and high. Thank you. You can lower them. Just 1 second. And the envelope, please. Oh. So on the matter of 2013-1, 61 in the room, in favor 12, against 5. This, along with the input, will be provided to the Advisory Council. This concludes the policy section. I'll turn over to Mr. Curran for our open microphone. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul. Okay, at this time, we're going to have an open mic section, and that will, let me run back here. That will be open for any policy matters people want to discuss. In particular, if you have new policy areas you want worked on, this is the time for you to express your concerns and have others hear them, find similar-minded people to work on your policy proposal. So the microphones are open. If people would like to raise matters about member resource policy, now's the time. Yes, Lee Howard.
Lee Howard, Time Warner Cable. This is a very handy document that's been printed out for us. It's also a very heavy document. How many trees gave their lives that we might have this for this hour?
That's an excellent question, actually. So we do a number of things at ARIN that aren't necessarily as green as they might be. Amongst other things, we have meetings where people fly around and go to rooms. ARIN does actually, for the travel we sponsor, we do actually pay carbon offsets because it's the right thing to do. We do try to avoid producing unnecessary paper and have gone to, in our regular policy meetings, we've gone to consolidated guides and less paper. We thought for kicking off these at NANOG, it might be good because not everyone's practiced to bringing up the draft policy proposal and the NRPM. Even though you got more practice looking at the NRPM this time around because of the guide. I think we probably will continue with paper for a few of them, but once people become practiced, if people don't need them, potentially we can omit them or have a stack of them on request and not presume everyone in the room is going to need one. Okay. Jason.
Jason Schiller, Google. My laptop screen is small. I like to have the text printed out. I'd be happy to pre-order it at the time I sign up for the meeting.
Good to know. Thank you, Jason. Microphones remain open. Yes, Martin.
Martin Hannigan, 20/30 vision with a +1 correction in my left eye. If you're going to print them, please don't use yellow. I can't see it.
Okay. Point taken. Discussion remains open. If anyone would like to talk about that or any policy matters, I will note that we are the last session of the day. We're sort of all between you and your first evening refreshment, but I will keep the microphones open for another minute or two. Remote participants, any questions? I'm closing the mic shortly. I'm closing the mics. The microphones are now closed. I'd like to thank everyone for participating in the open microphone. I'd like to thank you all for participating in ARIN's first public policy consultation at NANOG. Thank you very much. Everyone have a wonderful evening, and if nothing else, remember ARIN has the ARIN update tomorrow. You'll get a chance to hear about our activities then. Thank you.